before I really knew that much about fashion in terms of designers or history, couture houses, industry knowledge, all that kind of stuff, I was fashion curious. I was style conscious and I was scrolling on TikTok, of course, a lot. This was probably during the pandemic. I found a couple of images that were really, really striking to me. And I saved them in some sort of, inspiration folder, or maybe I just liked the video. And the text in the video said it was Margiela at Hermes. I think I probably knew what Hermes was at the time, but maybe not Martin Margiela. In the years since, I have learned a lot more about myself and fashion history. And on my most recent trip to Japan, I found a copy of this book, Margiela, the Hermes Years. It is one of those books you get at a museum gift shop if you go to see an exhibition. I didn't go see it. It was in 2017. And like I said, I wasn't really paying attention, but it was also at the Antwerp Fashion Museum. So it ran from March 30th, 2017 until August 27th, 2017. So Martin Margiela was appointed the creative director for Hermes Women's Ready-to-Wear, and he served in that post from 1997 to 2003. What I didn't know at the time when I first saw those images is that appointment was very controversial, very divisive. I mean, think of what each of these brands are known for. Margiela tabbies and the Hermes Birkin, they don't necessarily go together. I'm going to be quoting a lot from this book, obviously. This section is by Sarah Mower, who was a fashion journalist. She said, Margiela's appointment was only the latest move in a seismic wave of change which was running through the Parisian houses in the second half of the 90s. John Galliano had been hired at Christian Dior in 1996, whilst Alexander McQueen in the same year took over Givenchy. Louis Vuitton brought Marc Jacobs on board in 1998, and Stella McCartney was hired at Chloe. Suddenly, a whole young generation was being entrusted with the keys to establishment properties. These weren't the first of the guest creator-directors by any means, but Martin Margiela seemed like the most outsider of them all. At this point, he was known for his eponymous brand, Maison Margiela, which was started in 1988, so he had been operating it for about 10 years. It was very much known for a deconstructed look, a lot of vintage inspirations. He would remake vintage clothes. His collections, the clothing, the way he showed them, it was all sort of edgy and gritty and underground. Hermes, on the other hand, and I would highly recommend listening to the Acquired podcast episode about Hermes. I learned a lot from it. It was this really old, well-known, established French luxury house. They originally were a saddle-making company founded in 1837. I'm not going to go too much into it. It had a very specific image, sort of showy, traditional bourgeois that did not quite square with the idea of a more avant-garde designer. I promise you this story does have to do with my theory about why buying clothes in person is important. And one of the interesting things that I would suggest to everyone is if you do feel compelled by images, just by visual imagery, it's so fulfilling to go through and actually research the thoughts and concepts behind the creation of those images and that clothing, because you'll find that you actually align so much more with it than you ever thought. There are a lot of things in here that I was like, of course, that's why I was drawn to this, because he intended it to be enjoyed in this way. So let's get to that. The CEO of Hermes at the time, Jean-Louis Dumas, was very positive and excited about his choice. He said, the customer, the Hermes customer, is moved by art, design, and sensuality. In the middle are the craftsmen. Margiela is a craftsman at heart. We think his personality is at home with us. You can go and look more into how Hermes works, but essentially they have these divisions in the company called métiers, and métier kind of just means like job. And so it's essentially about like having people who are really good at this profession, at this craft, like let them do their work, let them control their product. Margiela, like I said, is making their ready-to-wear women's line. And Margiela's team was also very excited for his appointment. They were interested in the challenge of it. Jenny Mearns, his co-founder of Maison Martin Margiela, said, for me, the Margiela woman is strong and fearless personality with an artistic sensibility who uses clothing to strengthen her personality. I see the Hermes woman as an international independent woman who finds comfort and pleasant materials important. But there's still a lot of nervousness in the run-up before people actually see what Margiela does with Hermes. This was a funny section again from Sarah Mower, who published it in Harper's Bazaar. Martin Margiela goes to Hermes. Upper crust ladies of the world over must have been clutching their Kelly bags in terror at the vile revolution that was about to ransack their favorite bastion of Parisian good taste. Now, once the first collection comes out, people are kind of confused. Like, they expected blood, which is what the CEO said, which I like. They expected blood. And I have a quote here. If anything, it was the normality that was startling. People expected something like dramatic and hugely irreverent. And instead what they got was some very simple, well-made, elegant clothing. Again, Sarah Mower calls it a perfect Margiela double bluff. Like he wants you to expect him to go wild and destroy this beloved thing, and that what he gives you is actually really very sincere. And that in itself is a sort of reversal of expectations. But in general, people were not super impressed with the clothing. It got very mixed reviews. And this is really the meat of what I want to talk about. The issue with the clothing that Margiela was making for Hermes was that it was dress as experience rather than fashion as image. Now, what does that mean? This was sort of the most interesting part of this book for me. It delineates this idea of clothing that is for a viewer rather than clothing that is made for a wearer. Clothing that is a sensory experience for the person wearing it is much different than clothing that, in many ways, is for someone looking at you. First and foremost, and this makes so much sense as to why I was interested in the clothing to begin with, is that the basic tenet of his vision for the Hermes women is a proposition of comfort pushed to the extreme. I am a very comfort-oriented person. When I wear something that's a little tight in the shoulders, I feel like I don't have mobility, I feel like I'm too restricted, I don't wear it. Like I'll look at it in my closet and be like, "Oh, it's so cute." And I won't wear it. It doesn't work for me personally. And these collections were highly, highly focused on the comfort of the wearer. He knew that his collections were not going to look good or particularly attractive to someone who sees them on the runway. He really wanted his journalists to judge the clothes in person, if possible, like in small showroom appointments. Patrick Scalone, who, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm pronouncing everyone's name right, but he worked in communications at Maison Martin Margiela. He said, "I still believe that the collection was better suited to smaller salon shows for the clients in different cities than to a show for the press during Fashion Week. It was not fashion." So this goes back to the idea that there's this distinction between clothes that are for the viewer and clothes that are for the wearer, and clothes that are for the viewer being fashion. You could say maybe that clothes that are for the wearer are style, but I don't know if those two ideas map directly onto each other. Rebecca Arnold said, "So dramatic was Margiela's assertion of the wearer's primacy in each garment's design that some journalists were perplexed, unable to situate such simple clothing into a narrative of fashion as time-based and changeable. How could such designs even be called fashion if they evolve solely in relation to the customer's needs and physical desires for comfort, rather than the media's need to constant news and visual stimulation?" Now, after the initial uncertainty about the collections, and especially with people looking back on them now with sort of rose-colored glasses in recent years, Hermes by Margiela has reached a real beloved cult status. The everlasting quality of these designs has stood the test of time, even if the initial reaction was somewhat subdued. They get into a lot more detail about the actual items he was designing. Obviously, I've been showing some images, but if you want more details, I recommend you look it up. It's very interesting. But overall, I want to talk about a couple of things. The first one being fabrics. He was very, very intentional with his fabrics, and the fabrics he used were extremely expensive. I mean, these clothes are all very, very expensive, and he wanted to use fabrics that felt good. A lot of the clothing, they said, was not lined. A lot of it was essentially double-faced. And because of that, you could wear it inside out. You could wear it many different ways. He wanted everything to be interchangeable and usable and essentially like lifelong purchases. As far as I can tell, there was a lot of cashmere involved, specifically cashmere flannel, or a type of cashmere flannel that he developed. But yeah, there's a lot of cashmere, and you can tell just like the way the clothing sits on the women. And that was very important to him, which he talks about creating clothing that makes you stand in an elegant way, because a lot of the jackets you'll see don't have closures, which would mean that you would have to hold them closed. That's not something that I personally love. I don't want to have to hold closed like a winter coat, but just the intentionality behind creating something that has to be worn in a physical, specific way. He would say that it was about creating beautiful shapes, like physical shapes with women's bodies. So like the pockets were placed in very specific ways so that when you put your hands in the pockets, like you looked elegant. His idea was that people would say, "Oh, what a beautiful woman," instead of like, "Oh, what a beautiful jacket." Like it was about making the person shine. You know, some people say like, you should never be less interesting than your clothing. This to me feels like the the natural extension of that. I think the current environment in the US specifically, different countries obviously shop differently, but in the US, there is so much online shopping. And I personally didn't grow up in a house like my mom refuse to buy clothing online. To this day, she will not buy clothing online. She will always shop in person. She buys gifts for us in person. She does everything in person. She's a stalwart believer in that. And for a while, I just thought that like it was like a little, I don't know, unnecessary of her to put her foot down in that way because I've gone through many phases. Mostly all of the clothing I buy is secondhand. So for a while, I was going to vintage stores and going to thrift shops and doing that all in person. Then when I started working more, I had less time. And then, of course, the pandemic, I did start buying more of my stuff directly from secondhand sites online like eBay, which I still love eBay. Me and eBay, love you forever. However, in the past year or two, I've been really moving back towards buying clothes in person. I think for a couple of reasons. At first, it was a little bit of an easier way to curb spending for me personally. Just if you have to buy something in person, you're just going to be buying less stuff because it takes more time and more intention and you have to go out and do it. And another thing that I had just been realizing is that I had a real hit or miss situation with the stuff I was buying online. Usually I was buying stuff that wasn't that expensive or could be returned or I thought I could sell or give to someone else. But I just didn't have the best success rate. And I was finding that obviously pretty frustrating and I didn't want to continue doing that. And obviously buying in person doesn't always work 100%. I've definitely bought things in person that I realized are uncomfortable or don't work on me or I'm just not wearing for whatever reason. But the success rate in general is much higher. In the US, online shopping for clothes is obviously a huge market industry pastime. And I think part of the online shopping craze has resulted in our lack of high quality clothing. Because if you're not seeing the clothing in person, if you can't look at the seams, you don't fully know what the quality is going to be until you get it. And by that time, like, are you really going to return it? Returning clothes is annoying. Like, that's part of the reason I don't like shopping online is because I hate shipping things. Like, I don't even like selling my own clothes online because I hate shipping things. So I don't think it's a crazy thing to say that online shopping is probably part of the reason that people don't have as much of an emphasis on quality in terms of clothing. We can talk about the Shein of it all, though I think there has been a little bit of backtracking on Shein, or maybe not backtracking. I think people are thinking about it a little bit more. One, honestly, I think because of the tariffs, but in general, I think the prices have gone up. So people are like, if I'm going to buy cheap clothes, I want them for cheap. You know, I don't want to pay a lot of money for stuff that's not well made. And for me personally, I think a lot of my knowledge around clothing and fabric and construction just comes from seeing clothing in person and touching it. And especially since I buy vintage and stuff that is a little bit newer, seeing the evolution of how things have been made. And I like going and touching fabrics and seeing fabrics and trying them on my body. And I kind of feel like I know what looks good and what seems like high quality almost intuitively. I mean, I have watched, of course, a couple of videos, and there are people who do this for their entire career. They break apart those leather bags, or people that go into stores like high street stores and talk about things that are well sewn and the different kinds of techniques you can find, and definitely go look those up if that's something that's interesting to you. But I also feel like there is a sort of natural education to buying clothing in person, especially again, like me, if you buy clothes secondhand, you're looking through so much clothing over and over and over again. I feel like you get pretty good at looking at something with a quick glance and being like, I'm like, okay, that's an acrylic sweater. Acrylic has gotten in some ways better, softer. And the same thing with polyester. Like you see polyester everywhere now. But I don't know, I have an eye and a touch for it. And that's because I've spent a lot of time touching clothing. So not only can you not try things on and see how they feel on your body and see how the fabric feels and what the seams look like, etc., when you're buying clothing online until, of course, it arrives, you also are dealing with the clothing in a very visual sense, much like this book is talking about. We're interacting with clothing these days, especially not only buying online, but seeing them on influencers. You're dealing with things in a way where the only thing that is sort of having an impact on you is the visual aspect and not the act of actually wearing it. And I think that's so interesting that that was such a big part of Margiela's ethos when he was at Hermes, because I think the lack of taking that into account, the way our clothing and fashion industry has been structured so thoroughly now around image and visual, it feels like we have left behind the sensory experience more and more. One of the final quotes I want to share with you is from Akiko Fukai, who is the director and curator emeritus at the Kyoto Costume Institute. She said, "I did not consider buying Margiela's Hermes pieces for the KCI collection, as they were rather understated and would be perhaps hard to show in exhibitions, but I wanted them for myself. With Margiela for Hermes, it was discreet yet remarkable. It is very easy to understand its sophisticated simplicity. Because it is pure simplicity, it is complicated, and that is the hardest thing to achieve." And it turns out this director, Akiko Fukai, owns around 20 Hermes pieces from this period. She said, "My favorites include a long coat in gray suede with no collar and no lining. I can wear it so many different ways in every part of my life. I consider myself a free woman, which is why I also like Kawakubo's work. But I don't want to have to obey the garment. It is only with these Hermes garments that I can be really free and careless, as they move with you. You don't have to think or worry about it." I think part of Hermes by Margiela's enduring legacy is that the people who bought these clothes and own them and wear them really love them. Even if they aren't or weren't initially impressive to see, they are remarkable to wear. I think that in itself creates a very different relationship with your clothing. I think shopping in person in general creates a different relationship with clothing. Now, a caveat I want to make, which I think is obvious, but we are on the internet, so I want to say this is not everyone's priority. It is mine, and it was Margiela's when he was making these collections. I'm very much concerned with my comfort and my ease of movement in clothing, but not everyone is. And also, obviously, you can have some clothes that's for comfort and some clothes that are not, but I'd like all my clothes to be comfortable, even stuff that I'm wearing for a wedding, per se. And that's not the priority for everyone. Some people do want to wear things that maybe are more for the viewer than they are for the wearer. I just wanted to make the point that I think the way we intake clothes and the way we experience clothes these days is very much external. Okay, I have one more quote. It's from the casting director for Hermes, Sybil de Saint-Phage. She says, "Similar to Rei Kawakubo, it's a way of wearing garments not to show, but to be. The seduction is inside, which shows on the outside." And that goes back to him sort of thinking about how the way a woman will feel in the clothing, how she will wear the clothing, will change the way she moves, and the way she feels will change the way she looks, because when you feel good, you look good, you know? I think most people can agree with that. One other thing I do want to say is that I have a couple videos coming up, one on watches, some on fabric, hopefully, since a bunch of people asked about that. I'm more than happy to go talk to some experts and share that knowledge with you guys. Something interesting that came out of my sort of pre-discussion with the gentleman who's going to be joining me for the watches video is that he said he really suggests that people buy watches in person, especially if they're new to buying watches. And once you know watches really well, then maybe you can go online and find a watch because you've seen it in person before, or you know a lot about the way it looks or the way it functions or the way it feels. And at that point, yeah, you can go, bargain hunting online. And I think there is definitely stuff that I also buy online because I feel like I know the designer well enough, or I've tried on something like that in person, so I know sort of the way it will feel or look or what the quality will be. And stuff like that is like, I have a couple of Jill Sander button-downs that I love, and because I have a couple, I sort of trust them to be the way I like them, so I wouldn't be opposed to buying more of them if I found a good deal online. And yeah, people I think who really know their brands or know their items, it is still great to buy online because that's usually where the best deals are. But yeah, otherwise, I think try getting in those stores. And don't even buy, maybe. Just go into stores and touch everything. No one will get mad at you, I promise you. I mean, if someone chases you out of a store because you don't seem like you're buying anything, that's nasty behavior. But otherwise, if you go in and you're confident and you're just like, oh, I'm just looking, I'd love to see what you have in stock, you shouldn't have any problems. Touch some clothes.